This 1863 photograph was meant to document property, but it became proof of a man's humanity. Dr. Rachel Torres had worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture for 8 years, but certain discoveries still took her breath away. On a humid August morning in 2024, she sat in the museum's climate-controlled archive, carefully examining a collection of Civil War-era photographs recently acquired from a private estate in Louisiana. The collection had belonged to the descendants of a Union Army quartermaster who had confiscated Confederate property during the war's final years. Among requisition orders, supply manifests, and military correspondence were dozens of photographs, some of battlefields, some of officers, and some of plantations seized by Union forces. One photograph immediately caught Rachel's attention. Unlike the others, this one had been mounted in an expensive frame, suggesting it had been valued by its original owner. The image showed 23 people arranged in 3 neat rows in front of a large plantation house. All of them were black. All of them were enslaved. Rachel had seen similar photographs before. Plantation owners occasionally commissioned inventory photographs to document their human property for insurance purposes or legal claims. What made her pause was the notation on the back of the frame, written in careful 19th century script. Belle Terre Plantation, Louisiana. Property documentation, April 1863. Photographed by order of Colonel Marcus Beaumont for evacuation. Total value, $1,800 to $400. Each person in the photograph was listed by name, age, occupation, and assigned monetary value. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she read the list. These weren't just names in a ledger. These were people whose faces she could see, frozen in silver and paper, their humanity reduced to dollars and cents. But as she looked closer at the photograph itself, something struck her as unusual. The people weren't arranged randomly. There was a deliberate pattern to how they stood. Certain people close together, hands positioned carefully, subtle touches that suggested intention rather than the photographer's arbitrary arrangement. Rachel pulled out her digital magnification tools and began to examine the image more closely. And then she saw him, a man in the second row, perhaps in his late 30s, standing with quiet dignity. His right hand rested on the shoulder of a young boy beside him. It wasn't a casual placement, it was deliberate, protective, purposeful. Rachel checked the list on the back. Benjamin, age 38, field worker, $200. What were you trying to tell us, Benjamin? Rachel whispered to the photograph. Rachel spent the next several days studying the photograph with increasingly sophisticated imaging technology. Modern digital analysis could reveal details invisible to the 19th century eye. Subtle expressions, small gestures, evidence of relationships and emotions that the original photographer might never have noticed or cared about. The more she examined the image, the more convinced she became that something intentional was happening. The 23 people weren't just standing where they'd been told to stand. They were positioned with purpose. Benjamin stood in the center of the second row. His hand rested on the shoulder of a boy listed as Thomas, age 9 and house servant, $600. Immediately to Benjamin's left stood a woman identified as Sarah, age 35, cook, $900. Her hand was tucked into the folds of her dress, but when Rachel enhanced the image, she could see Sarah's fingers were extended slightly toward Benjamin's arm. Not touching, but close, suggesting connection. In the front row, directly in front of Benjamin, sat an elderly woman, Mama Rose, age 71, no assigned work, $50. Her advanced age and minimal value suggested she was considered past her productive years, kept on the plantation more out of custom than economic sense. But her positioning directly in front of Benjamin seemed deliberate. Rachel began mapping out the physical relationships in the photograph. Who stood near whom? Whose hands touched or nearly touched? Who looked at the camera and who looked slightly to the side, their eyes connecting with someone else in the frame? A pattern emerged. The 23 people weren't strangers arranged by the photographer. They were families, deliberately positioned to stay close to each other even in this dehumanizing documentation. Rachel pulled out the historical records that had accompanied the photograph collection. There were Confederate Army requisition forms, property seizure documents from Union forces, and, most valuable, a partial plantation ledger from Belle Terre covering the years 1860 to 1863. The ledger confirmed what Rachel had suspected. Benjamin wasn't listed alone. The entries showed family relationships, carefully tracked because they affected the plantation's labor organization. Benjamin, married to Sarah, children, Thomas, age 9, little Benjamin, age 6, Grace, age 4, mother, Rose. They were a family, and in that photograph, meant to document them as property, they had found a way to document themselves as human beings connected by love. To understand why this photograph had been taken, Rachel needed to understand what was happening in Louisiana in April 1863. She pulled up military records and newspaper archives from that period, constructing a timeline of events that led to that moment frozen in silver and paper. By April 1863, the Union Army controlled New Orleans and was steadily advancing up the Mississippi River and into Louisiana's interior. Confederate plantation owners in the region faced an impossible choice: stay and risk having their property confiscated by Union forces, or evacuate deeper into Confederate territory, taking what they could carry. Belterre Plantation was located about 60 miles northwest of New Orleans, directly in the path of Union advancement. Its owner, Colonel Marcus Beaumont, was a Confederate officer who had left the plantation's management to his wife and an overseer while he served in the Army. By early 1863, it was clear that Belterre would soon be in Union hands. Rachel found a letter from Beaumont to his wife, dated March 1863, preserved in the Louisiana State Archives. "My dearest Eveline, you must prepare to evacuate Belterre by the end of April. Take the silver, the important papers, and whatever household goods the wagons can carry. The Negroes will be moved to our cousin's plantation in Texas. I have arranged for a photographer to document them before transport. We will need proof of our property for compensation claims, should we prevail, or for insurance purposes, should we not." So the photograph was commissioned specifically because the enslaved people were about to be moved. In the chaos of war, this documentation would serve as proof of ownership and value, a way for Beaumont to claim compensation if they were lost, freed, or confiscated. Rachel found the photographer's business records next. Henri Durand was a New Orleans photographer who had fled to the countryside as Union forces approached. He was taking commissions from evacuating plantation families, creating what he advertised as property documentation photographs, essential for legal protection in these uncertain times. Durand's account book showed the Belterre Commission. April 15th, 1863, Beaumont Plantation, 23 subjects, 25 doors zero, completed satisfactorily. 23 subjects. Not 23 people, not 23 human beings. Subjects, property, things to be documented like furniture or livestock. But Rachel was beginning to understand that Benjamin had seen this moment differently. He had recognized something the Beaumonts and Durand had not. This might be the only photograph of his family that would ever exist. Rachel expanded her research to understand what Benjamin would have known about photography in 1863 and what he might have understood about its significance. She consulted with historians specializing in enslaved people's perspectives and experiences during the Civil War era. Photography was still relatively new and expensive in 1863, accessible primarily to wealthy white families. Enslaved people were occasionally photographed, but almost always as property documentation, anthropological curiosities, or as backdrop to their owners' portraits. The idea of black families commissioning photographs of themselves was virtually unheard of in the South, but Benjamin would have known what photographs were. He would have seen the Beaumont family's portraits hanging in the plantation house. He might have watched from a distance when traveling photographers came to document weddings, christenings, or simply to capture the family's prosperity. Rachel found a crucial piece of evidence in the Freedmen's Bureau records, a testimony given by Benjamin himself in 1865, 2 years after the photograph was taken. The testimony was part of a claim Benjamin filed trying to locate his mother, Rose, and his youngest daughter, Grace, from whom he'd been separated during the war. In describing his family, Benjamin mentioned the photograph. "In April 1863, before they moved us to Texas, the master had a photograph man come. He put all of us in rows like we were tobacco bales being counted, but I knew what a photograph was. I'd seen them in the big house. I knew it was the only picture of my family that might ever be made. So when that man arranged us, I made sure I stood by my boy Thomas. I made sure Sarah stood close. I made sure Mama Rose sat in front of me where I could see her. The photograph man didn't care how we stood as long as we stayed still, so I positioned my family. If that photograph survived, if it still exists somewhere, it shows that we were together, that we were a family, not just property." Rachel sat back from her computer, overwhelmed. Benjamin had understood exactly what was happening. He had recognized the photograph for what it could be, not just documentation of property, but documentation of humanity, of family, of love, that persisted even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. He had used the master's tool against its intended purpose. A photograph meant to reduce them to monetary value had been transformed through Benjamin's awareness and intention into proof that they were so much more. Rachel's next task was to trace what happened to Benjamin and his family after that photograph was taken. The plantation ledger provided the first clues. On April 20th, 1863, just 5 days after the photograph was made, there was an entry. 23 Negroes departed for transport to Texas, accompanied by Overseer Jackson, estimated arrival June 1863. But the journey to Texas was more than a simple relocation. Rachel found Confederate military transport records showing the route. Belterre to Shreveport by wagon, then overland through eastern Texas to a plantation near Houston owned by Beaumont's cousin. The journey would take nearly 6 weeks through contested territory, with Union and Confederate forces constantly shifting positions. The transport records were fragmentary, but Rachel pieced together what she could from multiple sources. In late April 1863, Union cavalry units were actively disrupting Confederate supply lines and communications in northern Louisiana. Any group traveling through the region risked interception. Rachel found a report from a Union cavalry captain, dated May 3, 1863. Intercepted a Confederate transport convoy attempting to move enslaved persons from Claiborne Parish toward Texas. The group consisted of 23 individuals under guard of 3 Confederate overseers. We liberated 14 of the captives, who have been directed to contraband camps in New Orleans. The remaining 9, along with the overseers, escaped during the engagement. 14 freed, 9 who escaped with the overseers, presumably continuing to Texas. Rachel's heart raced. Which group had Benjamin been in? Had he made it to freedom, or had he been among those who reached Texas and remained enslaved for 2 more years until the war ended? She returned to Benjamin's 1865 Freedmen's Bureau testimony, reading more carefully this time. When we were being moved to Texas in May 1863, Union soldiers stopped our wagons. There was shooting. In the confusion, I grabbed Thomas and ran toward the Union men. Sarah was behind me with little Benjamin. But Mama Rose couldn't run fast, she was too old, and Grace was with the overseer in the first wagon. By the time the shooting stopped, the first wagon was gone. They took Mama Rose and Grace and 3 other families to Texas. I lost my mother and my youngest daughter that day. Rachel felt the weight of it. The photograph, taken just weeks before, had captured Benjamin's entire family together. It was meant to document property being transported. Instead, it had accidentally documented the last time this family would be complete. Benjamin, Sarah, Thomas, and little Benjamin had reached freedom. But Rose and 4-year-old Grace had continued on to Texas, separated from their family in a moment of chaos. Rachel found multiple documents showing Benjamin's desperate attempts to locate his mother and daughter after the war ended. His 1865 Freedmen's Bureau testimony was just the beginning. Between 1865 and 1870, Benjamin had written or dictated at least 12 letters to various bureau offices, churches, and aid organizations across Texas and Louisiana. Each letter contained the same information. My name is Benjamin, formerly enslaved at Belterre Plantation, Louisiana. In May 1863, my mother Rose, age 71, and my daughter Grace, age 4, were taken to a plantation near Houston, Texas, owned by the Beaumont family. I have been searching for them since gaining freedom. If anyone has information, please contact the Freedmen's Bureau office in New Orleans. The letters were heartbreaking in their repetition and persistence. Benjamin was literate. He'd learned to read and write sometime between 1863 and 1865, likely with the help of Union Army teachers or missionaries who worked with freed people. His handwriting improved visibly across the years of letters, but the message remained desperately the same. Rachel found responses to some of Benjamin's letters, mostly stating that no information was available, that records were incomplete, that so many families were searching for separated relatives that the task was overwhelming. The Freedmen's Bureau was understaffed and underfunded, trying to help millions of formerly enslaved people navigate freedom, find family members, negotiate labor contracts, and pursue education. Individual searches often went unanswered. But Rachel also found something else. Benjamin didn't just write letters. In 1866, he had traveled to Texas himself. A Freedmen's Bureau agent in Houston recorded his visit. Benjamin presented himself at this office, seeking information about his mother and daughter, believed to be in the Houston area. He carried with him written descriptions and stated that a photograph exists showing his entire family, taken in Louisiana in 1863. He believes this photograph might help identify his relatives if located. We have provided him with a list of plantations in the region that may have received Louisiana refugees during the war. He intends to visit each one personally. Rachel felt tears forming. Benjamin had walked, probably walked, because few freedmen could afford any other transport. From plantation to plantation, searching for Rose and Grace, and he had remembered the photograph. He understood that if he could somehow find it, it would prove who they were, show what they looked like, demonstrate that they were family. Rachel turned back to the photograph on her screen. Benjamin stared out from 1863, his hand on his son's shoulder, his family arranged around him. He'd had no idea, in that moment, that he was creating the only evidence that might someday reunite them. Rachel needed to understand how the photograph had survived and where it had been for 161 years. She returned to the provenance documents that had accompanied the collection donated to the Smithsonian. The story of the photograph's physical journey was almost as remarkable as the story it contained. When Union forces captured Belterre Plantation in June 1863, a quartermaster unit was assigned to inventory and confiscate valuable property. Captain William Morrison, the quartermaster responsible for Belterre, had been a photographer himself before the war. His personal papers, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, included a diary entry from June 1863. Examined the Beaumont house today. Most valuables already removed, but found extensive documentation in the library, including property records and several photographs. Among them, a remarkable image of 23 Negro persons, photographed with unusual clarity. The reverse lists their names and prices like livestock. It is a damning document of this institution's evil. People bought and sold like chairs or horses. I'm preserving this photograph as evidence of what we are fighting to end. Someday, perhaps, these individuals, or their descendants, will want to know that this record exists. Morrison had recognized the photograph's significance, though for different reasons than Benjamin had intended. Morrison saw it as evidence of slavery's cruelty. Benjamin had meant it as evidence of his family's humanity. Both interpretations were valid, and both were preserved in the photograph's survival. Morrison kept the photograph throughout the war and brought it home to Boston in 1865. His family preserved it for generations, passing it down with the story of their ancestor who had fought to end slavery. In 2023, Morrison's great-great-great-granddaughter, preparing to downsize from her family home, donated the entire collection of her ancestors' war materials to the Smithsonian. So the photograph had spent 160 years in Massachusetts, carefully preserved but unknown to the people it depicted. Benjamin had searched for it and never found it. His family had wondered if it still existed. And now, finally, Rachel had discovered it. But the question remained, had Benjamin ever found Rose and Grace? Rachel returned to the Freedmen's Bureau records, determined to trace every possible lead. Finding records of a 4-year-old girl sold or transported during the chaos of the Civil War's final years would have been nearly impossible, except that Rachel had one crucial advantage. She knew Grace's name, her approximate age, and most importantly, she knew that Grace had been with a woman named Rose when they were taken to Texas. Rachel started with Texas Freedmen's Bureau records, searching for any mention of women named Rose or girls named Grace registered in the Houston area between 1865 and 1870. The records were incomplete. Many had been destroyed, lost, or simply never created. But what survived was digitized and searchable. She found several possibilities, but one entry stood out. In 1866, a Freedmen's Bureau agent in Houston had recorded helping an elderly woman named Rose locate her son in Louisiana. The entry noted, Rose, approximately 73 years of age, residing with the family of former enslaved persons on the Harrison property outside Houston. She requests assistance contacting her son Benjamin, last known to be in New Orleans area. Unable to write herself, dictated letter to be sent to New Orleans Bureau office. The age matched. The name matched. And most importantly, she was searching for a son named Benjamin in New Orleans. This had to be Benjamin's mother. Rachel found the letter itself in the New Orleans Freedmen's Bureau files. It had been received in July 1866. To the Bureau office in New Orleans, my name is Rose. I'm looking for my son, Benjamin, who was at Belterre Plantation before the war. We were separated in 1863 when Union soldiers stopped our wagons. I was taken to Texas with my granddaughter, Grace. Benjamin, if you get this letter, we are alive. Grace is with me. We are in Houston. Please come find us or send word. Your mother, Rose. Rachel's hands shook as she read. Rose had survived. Grace had survived. They had stayed together, and Rose had managed to send a letter to exactly the right place. But had Benjamin received it? Rachel searched through Benjamin's correspondence file. There, a letter dated August 1866, written in Benjamin's increasingly confident handwriting. To the Bureau office in Houston, Texas. I received word that my mother, Rose, and my daughter, Grace, are alive and in Houston. I'm departing New Orleans immediately to find them. Please tell them I am coming. Please tell them we never stopped searching. Benjamin. He had received Rose's letter. He had responded immediately. After 3 years of searching, he was going to them. Rachel found the record of Benjamin's arrival in Houston in September 1866, documented by a Freedmen's Bureau agent who had helped facilitate the reunion. Benjamin, formerly of Belterre, Louisiana, arrived in Houston today, seeking his mother Rose and daughter Grace. With the Bureau's assistance, he was directed to the Harrison property where they currently reside. I accompanied him to ensure safe passage. The reunion of this family, separated by war and slavery, was profoundly moving. Benjamin's mother, though elderly and frail, wept with joy. His daughter Grace, now 7 years old, barely remembered her father, but was told by her grandmother that this was the man who had searched for her since she was 4. Sarah, Benjamin's wife, and their sons Thomas and little Benjamin had remained in New Orleans, awaiting word. Benjamin intends to bring Rose and Grace back to Louisiana, where the family can be reunited completely. Rachel felt overwhelming relief reading this clinical, bureaucratic description of what must have been an emotionally devastating and beautiful moment. After 3 years, Benjamin had found them. The photograph had been taken in April 1863, showing them all together. By May 1863, they were separated. Now, in September 1866, they were being reunited. But Rachel wanted more detail. She searched for any other documentation of Benjamin's family after 1866. She found them in the 1870 census, living in New Orleans. Benjamin, age 45, laborer. Sarah, age 42, laundress. Rose, age 78, not employed. Thomas, age 16, apprentice carpenter. Benjamin Jr., age 13, in school. Grace, age 11, in school. They were together, all of them, living as a free family in New Orleans, with the children attending school, something that would have been illegal just 7 years earlier. Rachel continued tracing the family through subsequent census records. She found Grace listed in the 1880 census as Grace Williams, age 21, married to a carpenter named Joseph Williams. She and Joseph had 3 children. Grace was listed as literate. She'd learned to read and write in the freedmen's schools that Benjamin had clearly prioritized for his children. In the 1900 census, Rachel found something remarkable. Grace, now 41, was listed as a schoolteacher in New Orleans, living with her husband and 5 children. Her occupation was recorded as teacher, Negro Elementary School. The little girl who had been valued at $400 in 1863, who had been separated from her family at age 4, who had been documented in a photograph as property, had become a teacher, educating the next generation of free black children in New Orleans. 6 months after discovering the photograph, Rachel organized a public presentation at the Smithsonian. She had spent those months not just researching Benjamin's family, but trying to locate their descendants. Through genealogical databases, church records, and collaboration with family history researchers in New Orleans, she had succeeded. On a cool March evening in 2025, the museum's auditorium was filled with people, historians, educators, museum visitors, and most importantly, 12 descendants of Benjamin and Sarah's family, including 2 descendants of Grace. Rachel stood before a large screen displaying the 1863 photograph, digitally restored and enlarged so every face was clearly visible. She told Benjamin's story from beginning to end, the photograph's commission as property documentation, Benjamin's deliberate positioning of his family, the forced journey to Texas, the separation, the years of searching, and finally the reunion. This photograph, Rachel said, was created to document human beings as property. Colonel Beaumont commissioned it to prove ownership, to establish monetary value, to create a record of assets that could be claimed, sold, or compensated if lost. The photographer arranged 23 people in rows and captured their images in silver. On the back of the frame, each person was listed with a price. But Benjamin understood something that Beaumont and the photographer did not. He understood that this might be the only photograph of his family that would ever exist. So, in the brief moments before the shutter closed, he transformed this image. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder. He positioned his wife close beside him. He made sure his mother sat where he could see her. He turned an act of dehumanization into an act of love. The photograph was meant to prove that these people were property. Instead, it proved that they were human beings, connected by family bonds, capable of love, worthy of dignity, determined to be remembered not as dollars and cents, but as fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, grandparents, family. Benjamin never saw this photograph again after it was taken. He searched for it, hoping it might help him find his mother and daughter. But the photograph had been confiscated by Union forces and taken to Massachusetts. For 160 years, it was preserved by people who valued it as historical evidence, but who had no way to connect it to the family it depicted. Now, finally, we can return it to its rightful owners, not the plantation that commissioned it, but the people whose humanity it documents. Rachel gestured to the descendants in the audience. This is Benjamin's legacy. His great-great-great-grandchildren are here tonight. Grace, the 4-year-old girl in this photograph, lived to be 84 years old. She became a teacher. She raised educated children who raised educated children, and she told them all that her father never stopped searching for her, and that someday, somehow, the truth would be known. This photograph was meant to document property, but it became proof of a man's humanity and of his family's enduring love. The audience sat in silence for a long moment. Then, one of Grace's descendants, a woman named Dr. Jennifer Williams, who taught history at Xavier University, stood up. "May I say something?" Rachel nodded. Jennifer approached the screen, looking up at Benjamin's face enlarged before her. "My grandmother used to tell me that her grandmother Grace talked about a photograph that was taken before the family was separated. Grace said her father told her, 'Remember that the photograph exists. Remember that it shows us together. Remember that we are family no matter what happens.' Grace carried that memory her entire life. And now, 162 years later, we finally see what she remembered. We finally see Benjamin's face, my great-great-great-grandfather, and we understand what he was trying to do. He was leaving proof. Not for his masters, for us, for his descendants. So we would know where we came from, so we would know that we came from love." She turned to Rachel. "Thank you for finding him. Thank you for telling his story. Thank you for understanding that this photograph is not about property. It's about family. It's about humanity. It's about a man who found a way to fight back using the only weapon he had. Love, preserved in silver, surviving across centuries." Rachel looked again at the photograph, at Benjamin's face, at his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. A photograph commissioned to document property had become proof of humanity. A tool of oppression had been transformed into a testament of love. And Benjamin's intention, to leave evidence that his family existed, that they mattered, that they were human, had finally, after more than a century and a half, been fulfilled. The photograph had told its truth.